Hey everyone, welcome to the PowerShell after party. I'm going to go ahead and bring in all. We have Jeff Hicks joining us. Jeff.
Hi.
Nice to have you. We have Steve Lee, Justin Grote. We have Mike, who I can't seem to find the right photo of.
That's okay.
We have Sydney, Jason, and we have Mr. Jeffrey Snover. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. So I would like to kick off by asking Jeffrey and Steve a question. Before we take questions from the community, we have a very, very special event going on. PowerShell's 15th birthday. Yeah. So first question is, what was expected when you started all of this?
Or Jeffrey, I knew did it turn out the way you expected?
Yeah, I knew we were going to change the world. There was no doubt about that in my mind. It took a lot longer and it was a lot more painful and it required a lot more resistance. But it was really just math, right? You just look and say, hey, servers, awesome. But is it about, an admin and a server? No. If we're successful with Windows Server, there's going to be lots of servers and there's going to be hundreds, there's going to be thousands, there's going to be tens of thousands. And the only way you're ever going to succeed with that is through automation. And so I knew we were going to transform Windows Server with PowerShell. I did not anticipate how much pain was going to be involved.
Awesome. Steve, do you have any input?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I wasn't there when PowerShell originated. PowerShell. When I wish there were actually some other folks we have on the team, like Jim, and some other folks who were there actually towards the closer beginning. I actually joined the PowerShell team when we first had the idea to take it cross-platform and open source, and that itself was a huge effort. As far as I know, that was the first part of Windows that actually became open source and kind of led the way for a lot of other teams at Microsoft. Now .NET actually went open source before us, but you could argue we learned a lot and it was a good experience, and we partnered closely with them. So
yeah, it's amazing the number of things that PowerShell led the way on. Really did. And as you say, I don't know, Steve, was there anybody else that succeeded with .NET Core version 1? And the only other one I remember is this game company out of London.
Yeah, I'm not aware. It was very primitive back then, so it's very limited.
Yeah, and the people do not understand how much effort went into this. Well, we had to throw away and rewrite 12 years worth of unit tests, right?
Yeah, well, there are different reasons why we had to go down that path. A lot of it was the test framework was proprietary. We had multiple test frameworks. We had a lot of redundancy and test. It just wasn't worth the effort to try to port those. It was better to write from scratch. Now that we're better, and Pester existed now.
No, you're right. Part of that was open source. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
It's been quite a journey. I've enjoyed the part that I played a role in.
Yeah, I definitely, being on the outside of that whole process, there was this whole period where people were just like, what's going on with PowerShell? Nothing is happening, when, behind the scenes there's this massive thing going on. But I mean, that was a huge vision. And Joey, who is no longer the PM, who's moved on to greater things, but him sticking through that and having to take all the punches for that, I mean, big credit to him, because that was a big investment for the team to do, but it really paid off, because we now have this PowerShell that works everywhere, is able to move at the pace that .NET moves at, and it really did pay dividends. I mean, just everywhere you can now run PowerShell 7, and all the environments it can now run in containers, Azure Functions, all these places where it just probably would have never left the Windows box if it weren't for this vision and path to really get with this new direction things are going. So I just wanted to say, if nobody's aware of that, that was a massive effort. And so just getting from 5 to 6 and all the issues with 6, and then getting from 6 to 7 to get it to a point where people were like, oh, I can actually use this to replace with 5.1. I mean, all the work that went into that was mostly behind the scenes. And, I just want to give you guys your props for that, because it's huge. And I want everybody on this call to be aware of how much work that was. If you ever want to know, again, it was all developed in open source. If you want to go through those tens of thousands of commits on the share, watching it grow, I mean, you can see, wow, they really had to do a lot to make this work. So
in the similar vein, the amount of thankless work required to go open source is incomprehensible. And of course, nobody really cares about that. All they care about is like, hey, what's it doing for me? But because the team didn't take the easy route, right? Went and did it right, did it the right way, talked to external people, figured out the right governance model. We had to iterate a few times, doing the hard work to do all the unit tests so that people could contribute and know whether or not it was going to work. It was a ton of work. But then that opened us up to, so anyway, what was the benefit of that? And the answer is not very much. But once we had done that work, now all of a sudden you're getting this flood of PRs from the community and you're seeing the benefit of that. You wouldn't get any of that without the hard work the team did on open source.
Yeah, and
I think Justin really nailed a point on that I think a lot of us, and it confuses a lot of people because it's like, well, I work in Windows. What do I care? You actually care a lot more than you might think, because a lot of other people, such as myself, we worked in disparate environments, meaning they didn't want to talk to each other. And managing those environments was even harder because you had to switch your tooling for every single platform you went to. PowerShell on Windows was great, but as soon as I switched to something else, now I had to switch to something else. With PowerShell being cross-platform, it made it so that I could use that tool across those platforms. And you might be saying, well, as a Windows admin, that doesn't impress me. No, but it is, as Justin was pointing it out, it enabled us to be able to do a lot of the features, such as containers, and move better into Azure. And so you're getting a lot of features that we would normally not have.
Yeah, I just want to highlight one thing that Jeffrey touched on real quick. Like, I think that we cannot understate the contributions the community has made, right? Not just in pull requests and opening issues, but also writing blog posts, evangelizing PowerShell. We would not be here if it wasn't for the community, in my opinion.
Well, I could tell you just today, it still seems a little foreign to me, but working with a dev at my organization, and we're trying to figure out how to automate DNS requests in the company from end users, and he's developing on his Mac and I'm working on Windows, and we're sharing PowerShell code, and it's just really not, it's an uneventful event to be able to work in tandem with two different OSs sharing a common core of PowerShell. So that's.
I cannot tell you how much that makes me happy. We had early on just looked at this and said, hey, it's sort of stupid that you have the Windows team and then the Linux team, and why do you have your tools are forcing this odd organizational structure, and then they can't work together. And I got great talent on Linux, but that's not helping my Windows guys. I got great talent on Windows. That just hurt my heart. And so the fact that was what we wanted to do. One tool that could allow teams to work together across, what cares what OS it is. Let's work together to solve the problem. So I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah, it's a real world, right? It's actually happening now. It's wonderful. Of course, that means I have to learn Mac to tell them how to get their PowerShell environment configured, but we'll work on that part.
Just tell them to do a dev container, it'll be fine.
Have you seen that new Mac OS, that new Mac PC? I mean, God, that's so fast. I've been thinking about getting one of those. It's crazy, the chip architecture. Man.
Hey, I have a question for Jeffrey and Jeff. So, and maybe Jason as well. So if you go back to the original days of PowerShell 1 and 2 to now, and maybe this is really more towards Jeffrey, but obviously Jeff has a long history here. Is there a feature in PowerShell that you guys thought would have a greater adoption, or you thought would go in a different direction? It has. There's been a lot of things that have come and gone in PowerShell, right, along the years. Is there something that you guys thought, this is going to be the be-all and end-all, and it just didn't go that way, or you decided to go a different direction?
Jeff, you want to go?
I was going to say, isn't there a whole book on that subject?
Yes, I know, but we got Jeffrey here he always has good insights.
I can't think of anything that I thought was going to take off that didn't in the early days. I remember back in the early days not fully understanding PowerShell and realizing, well, hey, how come I can't do this and how come I can't do that? And that was because the teams, like Active Directory, they hadn't produced their command list yet. So there was some misunderstanding in the early days about who's responsible for what. And even today, I still think there's some misunderstanding about which team does which part of PowerShell. Because PowerShell it's get service, but it's also get VM and get AD user. And those are different people who manage those types of things. So just trying to keep track of who does what is probably still an issue as it was back in the early days.
Yeah, I would say that I anticipate that the community would be more active in producing formatting files and type extensions. That's not as popular. I mean, we use it a lot. It's very successful, but I had expected more uptake in the community. The one thing that I really thought was going to be a big thing that did not take off at all, and that was transactions. So if you're not familiar with this, early versions of PowerShell could support transaction. You say start transaction, do a whole bunch of stuff, and then say, nah, never mind, and roll it back. Or say commit. And, you know, I'd long said, you know, in Windows, if you got 10 things to do 10 of them or 0 of them. Because if you do anything in between, it's not going to be a good day. And so the idea of being able to wrap a bunch of stuff in transactions, and that hasn't worked out. In fact, if you think about it, sort of containers where you just say, hey, if it doesn't work out, throw it all away, start from scratch, and you replicate the steps. And if something goes wrong, throw it away, change the step, do it again. That has really replaced transactions.
But the problem with transactions was it only really worked in the registry, and no one cared about that. They wanted it in the file system.
Yeah. Right. And at some point, I don't know if people know that Windows did support transactions in the file system, and then they were used. It's one of those things. It's like salt. You know, if you don't have any, it's kind of bland. And if you have a little bit, it's really great. And then if you have a lot, it really sucks. So people were trying to do a transaction where they put like 100,000 file modifications in a transaction. It's like, no, that ain't going to work. Like 5, happy days. 10, yeah. 100,000, no. It was a disaster. So they pulled it.
It's hilarious because I was going to say transaction commandlets because I did a lot of DCOM stuff back in the day and across different systems and needed it. So that was my thing. The other thing that I had on my list was something else that I used a ton of. I loved this. I talked about this. I helped people with this, and that was workflows.
Yep, workflows. That was my mistake. I'll eat that one. So, no, well, totally. So Lee Holmes actually came up with this wonderful design. And I said, no. Why? He said, well, we have this thing called the CEC, and the CEC says we got to do it this way. And so we're benefiting from the CEC. We got to be team players. That's the way we got to do it. And it was the wrong thing. We should have just said, that's not going to work. And it was the wrong granularity. It was difficult to predict what was a workflow and what wasn't. You know, it was just wrong granularity. Lee's design had a big seam, but that big seam made it very clear about what was script and what was workflow. And I think it would have been more successful had I not overruled him. So my bad.
Yeah, the only thing that was great about workflow was being able to do stuff in parallel, which we can now finally do in PowerShell 7. So I'm happy that there's no workflow. I got the feature that I wanted out of it, so I'm good.
Yeah, that was one of the feedback we got from people using workflow is primarily for concurrent script blocks execution. And Paul on the team did that work on for each object to make that very easy. So you don't have to do all the threading and process jobs yourself. Yeah.
So Steve, what's the deal on that? So we had it. It's in the pipeline, but what about the standalone for each? Are we going to add it there at some point?
No, we've had those discussions. There's a lot of stuff we want to do. It's a matter of priorities. So I think that it's probably not high up in the priority right now.
Yeah.
At some point you get to like, it's good enough.
Yeah. Right. Well, the community, it's what the community.
Like someone once told me like to ship is to choose.
Hey, sounds like you work with a really smart guy.
Yeah, there you go.
So we actually have a lot of people in the community asking about just ways to learn. And Justin put in a really good response. I'm gonna show here for everyone because I thought it is a great response. I think a lot of people want to get some resources in. If you guys have any recommendations of your own, and I know Jeffrey did a great video, and I might try and find it and pop it in the feed of him doing a pull request in about 10 minutes for a PowerShell feature, or I believe that's somewhere out in the intertubes. But yeah, what do you guys think are great learning resources for the community? And I know Jeff has a really good, I get an email sign up from Jeff. I think it's like once a week or twice a week with some really good just community things. What do you guys think are great learning resources?
I think Jeff Hicks is a great learning resource.
Yeah, I would say so. The first thing is that people learn in different ways. So you have to determine the medium that works best for you, right? So there's books, videos, in person, and sort of shared learning. And I just seem to think that Jeff and Don's series of books, PowerShell Monthly Lunches, is the go-to place to start with your journey in PowerShell. Now, Jeff has other books that are equally as good. And there is other books from other authors as well, but you really can't go wrong with picking up one of Jeff's books to start there. If you are someone who wants to actually dive into the code, there's a module called P.S. Cohen's by Joe Sallow, which is almost like a challenge response sort of scenario where you're given a question and you have to figure out the right response to it. But that is probably not the place to start. That's somewhere to sort of improve your skills. I lead a user group. I'm very proud of the user group, and I think user groups are a great resource for people to come and learn. However, user groups are not there to teach people how to do stuff. I think they serve as a better resource to show people examples of what the possibilities are and sort of send you home with ideas that you can sort of stew on and build on yourself. And then I would also add so Justin mentioned John Saville. You can't go wrong with his videos, and his YouTube channel is fantastic. He's been focusing a lot on Azure lately. That's a fantastic resource. But also got to give a shout out to Sean Wheeler and the guys over at Docs. The PowerShell Docs repo is fantastic. And if you haven't been there recently, Sean has added a lot of resources, not just on PowerShell documentation, but community resources, where to find things online, how to participate. So that's fantastic as well. And then there's a GitHub repo called Awesome PowerShell, which is just simply a markdown page of fantastic community resources. And there's about 60 or 70 resources on there of different user groups and modules and things like that. So I would check out Awesome PowerShell, and I could throw that in the chat. I have a link to it.
If you throw that in the chat, I can also make it as a banner, Mike.
Okay.
Well.
That's in the private chat. And last but not least, probably should not forget PowerShell.org, right? PowerShell.org is a fantastic community of people asking questions in a moderated forum. You need help. And last but not least, Discord and Slack have great PowerShell help resources. So there's lots of different ways to get help. But I think if you're going to start your journey, Monthly Lunches is probably the best foundational place that you can start.
I saw someone in the chat had mentioned Bruce Payette's book, PowerShell in Action. I would say it's an awesome book, but it's kind of intimidating for beginners. So I would say every expert should end up with PowerShell in Action on there. Yeah, exactly.
It's light summer reading. It's fantastic.
Exactly, and it's great for self-defense. And yeah, if you're going to want to be an advanced PowerShell user, PowerShell in Action, and then Lee Holmes's book, PowerShell Cookbook. Those are two great ones. By the way, the PowerShell Cookbook, it used to be Windows PowerShell Cookbook. Now it's PowerShell Cookbook, so it's cross-platform. And is that out yet? I
was going to ask the same question. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome.
The 44th edition doesn't have a date.
Okay.
I will put a banner for everyone to see that, so they can reference that and buy that. I actually have a question for Sydney. We had tons of questions in the Ask the Expert session. We have tried to get through them. There was one about secret management using PowerShell?
Yeah.
I don't remember just the question, but you are the expert on secret management using PowerShell.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll give a little overview as to what secret management is in case folks aren't familiar, and then watch the chat if there's if somebody had their question and wants to ask it again. So what secret management is a module that helps users manage secrets by providing a common set of commandlets to interface with secrets. So it's commandlets like get secret, set secret that allow you to use these single commandlets regardless of what vault you're actually interacting with. So this is what's really key about secret management, is that it's an extensible module that pairs with extension vault modules in order to allow you to interact with a wide variety of extension vaults. So some that are available today are things like KeyPass, LastPass, HashiCorp Vault, Keychain, Credman, Azure Key Vault. And these are all owned by community members who have contributed these modules and have made them available. Yeah, Justin, I'll pass it over to him if he wants to give a little plug and insight into the module building process, because he's been an incredible part of our development of this module. But these modules are available on the PowerShell gallery, and they allow you to interact with all of these secret vaults using a single set of commandlets. We also shipped a module called Secret Store, which provides a cross-platform local extension vault that encrypts secrets on the file system. And so this is just one example vault that you can use for a lot of common automation scenarios with PowerShell. And this module is compatible with PowerShell 7 as well. So I guess, Justin, I don't know if you want to add anything about any of your modules or anything I might have missed about secret management.
Yeah, sure. And I was kidding. I didn't mean to derail you. Yeah, I really believed, and again, one of the great things about this new open source world is, again, I don't work for Microsoft. I'm just an employee at a company where I use PowerShell to basically create my career. And one of the things that was really great when I saw this is that I saw a unified thing, is that, hey, I have this need for managing my secrets in all these different environments. And I got kind of stuff that I've cobbled together and made work and made use of the Windows Credential Manager, but I can never get anybody else to use it. So when it was like, hey, we want to make this first party interface into being able to get secrets in and out, I saw that. And sure enough, what came up was that, the project went up on GitHub. And so right from the very beginning, from the very first, I was able to be there and look at the stuff and say, no, I kind of want it to be more like this. Because like as a user, I want it to be more abstracted this way, and then more details. Like, hey, if I want to write a vault, I want these kind of interfaces so that, as a user, I can get that. Like I want to see comments for my secrets. And credit to the team. They took some of my feedback and they took other stuff like, yeah, we don't want to do that. And I was like, I totally understand why not. So, but again, that dialogue happened. And that's when you compare that to some other like sort of black box software teams that you see in other companies, like it's just an amazing night and day difference. And again, I didn't need a $1 billion company behind me. I didn't need to be spending a ton of money to get a voice. I just simply interacted on the GitHub and expressed my ideas. And my ideas, if they were good, they're like, yeah, that's great. If you want to contribute parts to it, great. And I did. And so as a result of that, with secret management, it has this whole way of building vault extensions. And so you can make a vault extension for secret management any way that you want, because they basically just provide you this interface, and you can provide whatever you want to this interface as long as it meets certain criteria. Your secrets can come from anywhere. They can come. I have an example. I think I did a demo where I took just a comma separated values file and made it a secret vault, just to show you can just use import CSV and export CSV. But so, beyond that, I've made extensions for KeyPass. I made an extension for any Chromium browser. So if you get the Chromium extension, that works for Edge, that works for Chrome, it works for any of those, that you can get secrets out of what's your own personal like password vault that syncs between all your different browsers for any kind of scripts that you work that way. And they're not that hard to write. Like you can write them in, if you only know PowerShell, you can write them in C#. And I'm actually writing one right now in F#. You can actually write PowerShell modules in F#. I found out. And so just in the ways of like, I'm a learning by doing kind of person, I wanted to learn F#. So the first thing I want to do is like, well, let me try writing a module in F#. And so I'm doing that right now. And so it's a really nice interface. Secret management, it's really flexible. And as a result, if there's something that you want to get secrets from, if you know PowerShell and you know how to get those secrets from that thing today, you can write a vault. It's just a matter of tying them up to these particular commands that you write into your vault. And so you can look at my examples. They're all on GitHub. And yeah, it's a really great platform. It's a really great standard way how you do Git credential today, that everybody's used to putting Git credential in their scripts to get a prompt to put something in. You'll very quickly get used to just putting in Git secret. And as long as somebody provides you with a vault that matches that name, and that's the great thing, is you can write your script to just say, I want a vault called my company secrets. And on my laptop, I might implement that in KeyPass. On somebody else's laptop, they might implement it in Bitwarden. On somebody else's laptop, they may pull it from Key Vault. And as long as the script just references that name, or they register the vault with that name, the script will work. And so it's real good. Yeah. Definitely shout out to Mike, who I'm going to copy and paste his demo of secret management. Mike has been a great evangelist of the secret management. He does demos on it all the time. So in the YouTube chat, you should see a link to that. Definitely worth watching if you want to learn more.
Yeah, and by the way, just one thing to note there, the namespace for keys is a uniform namespace. It's not a hierarchical namespace. So don't name your keys like Azure Key. Give them a nice long name because that's your namespace. And especially if you're going to be sharing it, if you've got like a group vault. Hey, Mike, superstar Jim Truer is in the house. Jim, I'm glad you came around, because earlier they asked us, for the folks who were at the very beginning, were there any portions of PowerShell that we thought were going to be like really successful that didn't turn out the way that we thought it would? It wasn't as successful as we thought it were going to be. I gave the example of transactions, so you can't take that one.
That would be. I think the hierarchical namespaces, the namespace providers, didn't take off like I hoped it would.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Hey Jim, what's something, since you're one of the, we were talking at the beginning about the old timers, and since you're one of them, and you were there,
really old,
really old. What is one of your favorite things that did make it? What do you think? What do you think one of the most important things to PowerShell that did make it successful is?
The access to C# direct syntax, C# to syntax. That was the gap filler that we needed to make sure that we had the coverage that we wanted. We knew early on that we wouldn't have the command coverage that we really wanted to have, so we needed a way to get access to all of .NET. And so we came up with a usable syntax to make that happen. There were some challenges involved there, but I think that we did a really good job. What we found was really useful, and it's still very expressive and gets the job done. You can still do so much more against all of .NET that doesn't have commandlets, and that's one of the reasons why.
I think one of the, and I wanted to ask Jeff Hicks about this, but I think one of the escape hatches that we used to always help people with as we were helping them learn PowerShell for an IT admin was, hey, if you don't have a commandlet, go to WMI, and then you can go to .NET. So the idea is if you don't see the commandlet you need, it's not that you're done with PowerShell. PowerShell still enables you to solve your problem. You just have to keep moving forward with that problem and to get there with it. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, what I always tell people is look for a commandlet first to do your thing. If you can't find the commandlet, then see if they're, like I said, use WMI or SIM or the .NET framework, but then build a PowerShell function around that. So you're still interacting with PowerShell and have all the features of a commandlet. I'm not a big fan certainly for beginners of having .NET code directly in their code, directly in their functions and scripts and whatnot that they were running, because it isn't intuitive. It isn't easy to understand. It's not documented. You're not writing it really for the next person who has to look at that and go, I have no idea what this class is. Whereas if you just write a PowerShell function, then they can work with it that way. If at some point you need the performance benefits you get from accessing .NET directly, then you know what? Maybe PowerShell is not the right tool for you. And you may have outgrown PowerShell and you need a third-party tool or something that's really dedicated to the task that you are trying to do. But yeah, PowerShell and being able to access the .NET framework is awesome. I mean, I do it on a daily basis when I'm debugging or trying to test something, figure out, okay, how is this not working? Well, let me look at the .NET class. But I can do that because I've been using PowerShell for so long. It's not something I would ask a beginner to do, though. And I just killed the class.
We're absorbing.
Everybody
Jeff.
stop.
We're
That's a bug
absorbing.
kill.
There's a lot of wisdom coming out. We're absorbing.
I get very passionate here.
Absolutely.
I do have a question for Danny because he's been quietly sitting in the corner. Why is code in in Cloud Shell so lame compared to the web version of VS Code?
Sure. Yeah, so the code editor that we have in Cloud Shell is actually not VS Code. It's what I like to call a cousin of VS Code. It's based off of the same Monaco editor, and then we just put that in Cloud Shell. So you do have a different option for editor that's native in Cloud Shell. So there's obviously the code experience, which is Monaco. There's Vim, there's Nano, etc. But if you want the full VS Code experience, you can use Cloud Shell from local VS Code within, believe it's called the Azure extension or the Azure account extension. Cloud Shell is listed there. And so you can use Cloud Shell with all the native goodness of local VS Code. And speaking of extensions of where Cloud Shell is, we're also in Windows Terminal if you prefer Windows Terminal. And really, if you want, we're even in the Azure mobile app, so you can use it from your phone. So anywhere you are, you can use Cloud Shell.
Yeah, there's a container for Cloud Shell too, isn't there? Yeah.
Yep. And you can even, if you want, the Azure Cloud Shell container image is open source, and I'll throw the link in the chat. But if you want, you can go and deploy that in your own Docker container as well, and you can submit PRs to add additional tools.
So
I just love the fact that there's this environment that is kept up to date, all the latest versions of all the tools, and you don't have to did I update it? Just go there and it's all there. I just love that about Cloud Shell.
Yeah, it's great, especially for your local environment if you are using Windows Terminal or VS Code, because then you don't have to worry about that work that I'd say we release Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell updating every 2 or 3 weeks, right? You don't have to worry about it. We'll just do it. And given we have these built-in integrations with VS Code, Windows Terminal, you can just barely modify your existing workflows and leverage this up-to-date environment.
Very cool. Now I have a question from the community, and actually it's something I've wondered as well. Why has the PowerShell extension always been .ps1 and never changed with the versions of PowerShell, like .ps2, .ps3, etc.?
Oh, Jeffrey, you want to talk to this, or?
Oh God! So
did you lose count, or
what's that? No. So
did
basically,
lose count?
There was this period where so everybody knows Vista, right? We don't realize this Vista, not our best release. That was the save, right? We had something before that called Longhorn. And basically, people were doing, Bill was all hot on .NET, and that caused people to do all sorts of stupid things. People were putting .NET into the kernel. They were putting a common control. It was just a mess. And basically, the whole thing collapsed. Well, instead of them saying, oh, well, maybe we didn't do very good engineering, they're like, oh, .NET's a problem. So there was this period of time for 2 or 3 years where basically everybody ran away from .NET. Now, there were exactly 2 people in the Windows environment that did not run away from .NET. One of them, his name was Scott Guthrie. The other one, me. And so we stuck with this. Anyway, so then the Windows guys were after us. I mean, they tried to kill us one way or another. I mean, they just kept coming at us. And so part of this was, versioning. .NET has versioning problems. And so this whole thing was all around a solution to the rocks being thrown at us by the Windows team. And we said, listen, hey, there's PowerShell, and we'll say it's version 1. And if we ever have some big breaking change, like a language breaking change, we'll change that to PowerShell 2. So it's there. We've engineered in the system. Somebody said, why don't you just call it PS? And then if you needed breaking change, make that PS1. Because we had to get through a group of people doing anything to try and kill us off. And this is the solution that we came up with. That's the real story. It was a mess.
PS would have been bad anyways, because PS is also a widely used extension for other things.
There you go.
PostScript and I think Photoshop might also use it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think now it stands out. It's so recognizable, right?
Yeah.
PS1. Oh yeah, baby, that's what I want. Give me that.
There you go.
I'm not sure I word it in that way, Mike, but yeah.
Hey man, got to support PowerShell to the end, right?
Absolutely. Another question from the community. Is there any talk about dependency injection for binary modules, maybe making modules more testable?
Not quite. I mean, like if you're talking about C# modules, I mean, you can use XUnit, NUnit, all those things today. I mean, there's nothing special because it's a PowerShell module.
Yeah, I've used Pester in the past as well. Did one of you work, Steve, did you work on Pester in the latest release?
I haven't worked on Pester, but I've used Pester. But I think, Justin, you were going to...
Justin.
Yeah, I actually made a, again, talking about the learning things by doing, I wanted to learn TypeScript. So I wrote a Visual Studio Code module for Pester testing, an extension. And I made this whole streaming PowerShell interface to Node.js, where it takes a PowerShell process and you have those different streams, like the information, the verbose, the warning, the etc. And it takes them and breaks them up into objects and then converts them into JSON, sends them across this pipeline, and then they get emitted as events in the Node.js side. So that what you have is this really fast processor of objects that get flown into PowerShell and then come back out. So then I also put a shim into Pester so that as Pester was running its tests, it could just start streaming those objects rather than have to wait for the end. And so I ended up with this really nice kind of high performance thing that allows you to run Pester tests. So that's an aside. I actually it ended up as a featured module on the VS Code Marketplace last month, which was really cool. I was very happy about that. Definitely worth checking out. It's called Pester Tests. Just look for it on VS Code. Don't use it with the preview extension until like 2 days from now, because the new rewrite broke it, but that's getting fixed. And big credit to Andy, who took over for Tyler for the VS Code extension. He is crushing it. He got his booster shot on Monday and he was sick, but he was just like right back in there like today, just like answering all my questions and getting stuff fixed. He is working really hard on that VS Code extension. And also huge credit to Rob, who he just did this massive rewrite of the whole PowerShell Editor Services engine. And again, you talk about thankless work, like we were talking about with the switch over to Windows PS. There was this whole engine that had to be rewritten, and he put on all this time, and it looked like nothing was happening with the VS Code extension for the longest time. But now things are going to be able to get rolling, and things are going to be a lot more stable. So that whole tangent aside, back to the original question. When making binary modules in PowerShell, I have a fair amount of experience of especially making what are called hybrid modules, where you have some parts that you write in C# and some parts that you write in PowerShell as they make sense. And I think what this question is more about is some of the trickiness of especially writing modules that are cross-platform for both PowerShell 5.1 and PowerShell 7, because you're writing something that has to work on both .NET Framework and .NET Core. The biggest problem, especially with Windows PowerShell, is assembly conflicts, where it used to not be that big of a deal because you only load a couple things, but now you have these modules where everybody uses Azure. Everybody has their, uses their Azure module, but if you want to write something and they update their assemblies, all of a sudden your modules conflict. And because the assembly loading doesn't work very well in Windows PowerShell, it doesn't work very well in .NET Framework compared to what you can now do in PowerShell, that gets tricky. And so as far as the testing and regression testing of that and making sure modules can interoperate, a lot of that is frankly really difficult right now. The nice thing is that in PowerShell 7 and .NET Core, the way that you can load assemblies is different. And they have these things called assembly load contexts, which are basically these sort of almost like little virtual environments, almost like containers that you can you can put assemblies in, and they can make sure that they don't conflict with each other. That comes with its own host of problems. You have to be basically really careful not to let objects leave that without sanitizing them. But I think that as the road forward goes forward, the big thing will be is that once we get to the point that people are comfortable with people making modules that only work on PowerShell 6 and above, like they're okay with it not having 5.1 support, then that's really going to enable the ability to make these modules that can exist where they can have their own different assemblies and almost run like different .NET applications, but not conflict with each other. And so as far as the testing goes for that, my big thing is that there's this thing called the PowerShell standard. If you just Google it, it'll come up. But it's basically this sort of GitHub reference that you can tie into a binary module that will sort of abstract away a lot of the differences with the different PowerShell modules so that you can write a module that'll work everywhere from 5.1 to 7. There's still a lot of issues. Generally start there. If that doesn't work, then you're going to want to do what's called multi-targeting, where you're going to want to make binaries just for Windows PowerShell and then binaries for everything else. And then at runtime, when you load the module, detect which you're running and load the correct extensions. But all that stuff's really tricky. I'm happy. I'm Justin W. Grote on Twitter. I'm happy to answer those there. I still consider myself a really like C# noob. I'm not very good at it at all, I don't think, but I'm kind of getting there. Like I'm able to kind of contribute to PowerShell editor services after kicking the tires of it for like 2 years, trying to get myself to do it. But yeah, when I would also at the very end, like if you can write a module just in pure PowerShell, do it, because you don't have to deal with any of these kind of concerns or any of these kind of conflicts. Yep. And it's just like, it's like, you know, Jeff was talking about, it's that .NET stuff, not only does it look ugly, but if you're not writing it in an environment you're comfortable with, but then you come across all these sort of conflicts because you're getting down into the weeds of where things happen. And while you have more power there, you also have a lot more responsibility in terms of making sure these kind of issues don't come up. So I think I'll stop that train there. But basically, and as far as testing goes, yeah, XUnit and Pester are my favorite. Like you use XUnit for the C# stuff and use Pester to actually make sure your commandlets work as they're expected. And Pester tests is a great way to do it. So go check that out on VS Code.
Cool. We have another question from the community. Kevin has asked, will we ever get a PowerShell 7 replacement for the DSC LCM, the local configuration manager?
Jason, you want to take this? Or you want me to answer?
Well, we both can pile in on this. So the idea is that taking DSC, and I assume that you're referencing that we've taken DSC back onto the PowerShell team, and we're working on it, and we're working on a version 3. Now, most of the work that we're doing with version 3 has been for an internal partner, but our work moving forward externally does not include the LCM. Now, for a lot of us that work with DSC, some of us are pretty thrilled about that, to be honest. I'm one of them. However, some of you, you know, for whatever reason, you might want an agent out there. Well, we're making it so that you can bring your own agent. Now, I know that sounds kind of, well, gee whiz, I don't know how to write an agent. Next question you should ask yourself is, did you really need one in the first place? So what we're doing is we're making it easier for you today. And as we start to roll out V3, which we haven't done that yet, we'll have more documentation to help you understand the new way that V3 looks. But quite honestly, it's really simple. You can, your resources need to be class-based resources, not script-based, that you want to use. And primarily what you're going to use is invoke-DSC resource, and then give that a property bag. It's so much easier to get this job done this way and fire that forward. But Steve, do you want to throw in some insight into the agent story?
Well, I mean, like right now, I mean, okay, so for people who don't know, like LCM Local Configuration Manager is dependent on WMI, and WMI is Windows only. We have this other OMI project, which we don't talk about anymore, which is kind of equivalent for Linux, I guess, but it has its own host of problems. I would love to understand like what people need from an agent that they can't roll their own as a simple PowerShell script that just calls invoke DSC resource. I mean, we already know there's some things that LCM provides that you'd have to rewrite yourself. But right now we're focusing on enabling a platform itself that's cross-platform. And so over time, if there is a need for an agent that we need to ship, we need to understand like what are the things you need, help us prioritize. But right now our focus is enabling people to write agents, not necessarily producing agent ourselves.
So I want to lighten up the mood a little bit. Jeff, what kind of wine are you drinking?
Yeah.
It is
Not
a
bourbon?
no, not bourbon. It's a wine. It's a Cabernet. It's what's the name? Cal Shannon? No. Anyway, it's a Cabernet.
Wonderful.
So I thought, should I do with the Scotch? I can't find any decent bourbon, and the rye I have is Cat Strength. It'll just knock me on my butt, given everything I've been doing the last 2 hours. So I'm just sticking with wine.
Well, I brought my my Japanese whiskey. actually, fun story of that one. I bought that for Abel Wang. That was my last drink with Abel before he passed. So I keep that by my desk. I don't drink and work at the same time, so the bottle is sealed, but it is one of my favorites. I actually want to ask, well, we have actually a community member that's asked a question. We've had a couple people ask this question. We've, first of all, had people ask if Jeffrey will run for president when Jason join him potentially. But yeah, I think people are asking for another duo series with Jason and Jeffrey. When will that happen?
Cue Jason.
Cue Jason. So yeah, we were setting up for that, but then something happened. The pandemic, right? So the pandemic happened. We're still working through the pandemic. Plus, we're still trying to get a release of PowerShell out. This is something that we will come back to and talk about. And the thing, though, that I would ask you is, what do you want the series on? Because the original series was on how to learn PowerShell, and that series is still really highly effective for that part in PowerShell. So I would turn that question back and say, what do you want to see? But I can guarantee you this, you will see more of Jeffrey Snover talking about PowerShell in the future. We'll figure it out.
Could I offer a suggestion?
Please.
Well, we're on the Azure DevOps YouTube channel hosting this. I am the host for the DevOps Lab. Why don't we do a automation PowerShell thing on the DevOps Lab, a series?
Well, you know what, April? Let's talk about that because that's an interesting idea.
Well, I think we should ask the people joining us what they think. I would love show ideas, topic ideas. We love community feedback. So if anyone has any really good ideas, we can implement that in the show. We can bring everyone along. Well, I'll say everyone. Might be a busy show.
Yeah, and I just want everybody to know that's watching this. I just want to give a giant shout out to April, who actually set all of this up for us, by the way. She helped us with the AMA, and then it was her idea to do the after party, and so that we could bring everybody on, because we knew that the AMA was going to be really short and all that. So I just want to give giant shout out to April for setting this up.
Happy to host you guys. It's my pleasure. It's kind of like my lifelong dream to sit here in a virtual room with all of you. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. So would you guys like more questions from the community?
I had a question for Jeff.
Go
How
for
has
it.
training changed in a world of pandemic?
I'm sorry, how's what?
How's giving training and education changed in a world in this pandemic world?
Well, obviously all the in-person stuff has pretty much dried up, at least for me. What hasn't dried up, though, are all my Pluralsight courses. So that kind of training, all that virtual training, that is just taking off. So people are continuing to do that. My viewer numbers for my Pluralsight courses continue to go up, which, thank God, I have that catalog of courses, because over the last year and a half, that's what really has been paying the bills. Because the in-person training stuff just is, pretty much gone.
Yeah.
And Jeff, didn't you do a new PowerShell series? Aren't you working on one?
I have, yeah. There's, I kind of started off a whole PowerShell 7 series for Pluralsight. So if people are just getting started and they want to say, hey, I need PowerShell 7, they can go through that. And I'm actually working on a course now. It's curious you mentioned DSC. I still believe that there are plenty of people who are using Windows PowerShell in small environments that want to use DSC. So I am redoing a complete soup to nuts Windows PowerShell DSC on how to do everything that you need to do in DSC in Windows PowerShell.
Cool.
So if you're still stuck in,
awesome.
not if you're stuck in 5.1, but if your environment is still, and a lot of people, their servers are still running 5.1 and there are no intentions to move them to 7, but maybe they still want to use DSC. So I'm going to try to give them something that they can work with.
I think that's fantastic, because one of the things that I didn't point out that I really want to is that DSC, what we now call DSC version 2, is still available, is available for download on the PowerShell gallery, is going to continue to be available. So if you've been using DSC and you like the way that DSC works that way, great, because it's still going to be there. DSC V3 is new investments that we're making, and we're still working on that. But V2, that's an excellent product for configuration management.
Yeah, and I make it clear at the beginning of the course that, PowerShell 7, there'll be something new. The concepts more than likely will continue. The technologies will probably change. But there's DSC now, which is perfectly acceptable, and I think a lot of people can still use. What they have to do with DSC, and this was always the problem with DSC, was that I feel like the DSC team tried to sell it as a product, and it's really a framework.
Yep.
It's not a finished product. There's lots of gaps that you have to be able and willing to fill in with PowerShell scripting. And for a lot of IT pros, they either couldn't or wouldn't make that leap.
Yeah, by the way, we were pretty explicit about that. And if you recall the context, back then you had like Chef versus Puppet versus Salt versus Ansible. There was like dog's breakfast of these things. And the problem was somebody like, oh, well, Puppet has a great, I don't know what, SQL providers. Like, oh, Puppet does a great job managing SQL on Windows. Oh, but they do a crappy job on, like, say, Exchange. But, oh, Chef has a great thing for Exchange. It's like, this is a mess. There's no architecture here. There's no, you can't build an ecosystem here. And then you got these people producing products, but they're fighting over like, oh, I can manage this thing. Oh, I can manage 14 properties. You can only manage 8. That made no sense. So we said, hey, our role as a platform is to be a platform. And so we're going to provide just enough of a solution, and it would be a scripting solution. We did not want it to be great because we didn't want these products to view us as competition, but rather to say, hey, why don't you have everybody write DSC providers so that we've got a uniform way. And then Chef, you can consume them all. DSC can consume them all. Puppet, Ansible, anybody can manage everything on the environment uniformly. So that was the thinking. And then probably at some point we should have gone back and said, hey, why don't we just go produce a great product and instead of just relying on some of these other things.
There's a question from the community from Kevin. Oh, sorry, wrong one. I clicked buttons. I'm not good at that. From Jason, is the new DSC a finished product with compliance reporting and whatnot, or how does that hook into DSC for compliance requirements?
That's a great question. New DSC is not a finished product, not close to a finished product. It's something that we're working on right now. I can let Steve talk more about it, but what we've been doing is we've been helping one of our internal partners as we've been working on DSC V3, but we still got more work to do. And what we really hope is that you'll provide us some feedback. If you've been working with DSC, I encourage you to come to the DSC community call. I don't have a link with me off the top of my head, or to the PowerShell community call. Or you can go to our repos and file issues on us. But we really like to have your feedback on configuration management going forward, so we can take a look at it and see what do we need this platform to do moving forward.
Yeah, Jason, do we talk to people about how much we're using it internally? Is that a safe conversation to have? Because DSC has been used incredibly a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to let Steve go here, but I just want to say something. If you haven't seen the DSC or the scripts that they've written in Azure Stack as an example of incredibly cool scripts that have been written, check that out too. But yeah, DSC is used all over the place. Steve.
I think Azure Stack is like an extreme example, but so there's been a couple of questions about, DSC as a platform versus a finished product. So I think it's okay to say, like, we've been working closely with the Azure Guest Config team, which is a finished product. So, we're building a platform for them. We're not building a platform only for them. So, as we get feedback, we're definitely interested in investing in this platform. But we're probably, I know that some people might be upset by this, but we're not going to build our own finished product. I don't think that's our role here. So we want to enable others to do that.
Yeah, right. But we're using it for security and some of the internal provisioning, and auditing, and it's the numbers are pretty crazy large. And again, you should understand, set expectations. This team is really the enablement team, right? There's things that this team and only this team can do, and there's things that things anybody can do. And so what we're trying to do is to say, hey, there's only so many resources. Whenever anything comes on the radar screen, we say, hey, is this something that somebody else can do? And if the answer is yes, it's like, okay, well, that's lower priority than things that only this team can do. Like, for instance, parallel for each. Really, this team was the only team that could do that. Whereas like a finished product on top of the infrastructure. Well, again, it kind of started with, Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt. They can all produce finished products on top of that. So it's not necessarily a good use of our energy to do it. And then also that often if we do something, then it might scare some of those other people away. And, we might get a D's worth project or a C project and scare away people who might come in and do an A or A+.
I have another question from the community, and actually we've had a few people ask this in the Ask the Expert session, so changing gears a bit. Sukaru has asked the question, is there going to be a Copilot AI support for PowerShell? So there's been a lot of talk, a lot of people asked about AI and PowerShell, what kind of place it has, but with Copilot coming out from GitHub, is there going to be a place for PowerShell and that to help people write their code better?
So for people who are already using Copilot, it already understands PowerShell. Like if you're using it in VS Code, in fact, it understands a lot more. Like I was very surprised that it was able to kind of, not all the time, but predict what I want to put in my Markdown file, which is just like a text file. But yeah, it actually does pretty good with PowerShell today already. So I'm not sure if the question was something else.
Yeah. I mean, if you just look at my Twitter at Justin W. Grote and search for the GitHub Copilot hashtag, you'll see all kinds of times where I'm like, GitHub Copilot, you scary. How did you know that that's what I want to do in PowerShell? I mean, it's just trained on code bases, and like it's pretty impressive. It doesn't always get it right, but a lot of times it'll get pretty close. And so it's pretty impressive, some of the stuff that it's able to figure out, especially if you do things like just make a comment and say what you want to do and then hit enter. Like what it'll produce is pretty impressive sometimes. You just say like, I want a function that will, sort strings and give me the ones that end in L. And then you just type that, like literally you say that and you hit enter and it will give you a function that's usually will do that or pretty close. Like it's pretty crazy, especially like when writing certain loops and stuff. I should pull up some of the tweets that I have of it, but it's pretty crazy sometimes how it's able to take what you're working on and kind of guess what you're doing. Like the technology behind that's really impressive. I mean, it's just really impressive pattern matching taken to the next level. So, but yeah, so I mean, I can definitely confirm that like it's there in GitHub Copilot and it is actually like reasonably useful, but not sure like if there's anything further that even the PowerShell team would need to do, since that's just basically trained on code bases.
Yep.
Awesome. Another question from the community, actually for Sydney, not to point you out, anyone else can answer. There was a question that someone had about whether or not modules will be able to self-update.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you may know, the module that we use to install and update and manage packages in PowerShell is PowerShell Get. And right now we're doing a major rewrite of PowerShell Get. The project is called PowerShell Get 3.0. And right now we're in the preview releases. We recently, a couple months ago, released preview 11 and preview 12 should be coming out by the end of this year. And this is a major rewrite to address many of the long-standing issues with PowerShell Get. And so that work is pretty well scoped out. You can find it in our GitHub. Today it's organized in projects. And also we have some blog posts kind of outlining what that project looks like. But we've also started to kind of look forward to what we can start solving with package management in PowerShell after this release. And we hope that we'll be able to sort of iterate on some of these issues much more quickly now that we have a more manageable architecture for the module. And one of these issues that has come up and does get requests from time to time is whether or not modules can self-update. Another way that this is framed is what about update notifications for modules? And this is an issue that we're looking to kind of come up with a creative solution that really still aligns with PowerShell best practices on. And so right now there is an open issue on GitHub that we're taking comments on and discussion around this very issue. So definitely check that out. But the short answer is that is not currently in our plans, and I would want to be pretty cautious about automatically updating modules, but we are looking to creative ways to sort of solve this issue around how folks can know that their modules need to be updated and update them in a seamless way. So maybe this could happen at the some sort of metadata around the package that you know certain packages that you trust would want to be updated or known. But definitely check out that issue if you're looking to be part of the discussion or have scenarios you may want us to consider around this issue.
Awesome. I'm going to throw another question from the community out to you all. Wayne wants to know, is the guest configuration team the same as the Azure Automation team?
It is
if any of you know that.
Short answer is not the same team. It's actually very different. Guest config is really, if you have guests like VMs in Azure, it makes it easy to do a declarative configuration of those things, and it uses DSC underneath. Azure Automation, still alive and kicking. I don't know what else to say there. I mean, they use PowerShell. Azure Functions is a different team. They also use PowerShell in addition to other languages.
Yeah, I do know that the Azure Automation team announced that they do plan to support PowerShell 7 in automation.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was announced. I didn't want to say anything.
that was actual a public announcement.
Okay, so then we can talk about that.
They haven't given dates
Thanks,
or anything.
Captain.
Just said they
Yeah, we've been involved with that, but I don't want to announce anything on their behalf. But yeah, they're moving towards PowerShell 7 support. If they've announced that, then it's true. If they haven't, I take it back.
Brett Miller says it's in support it's in public preview as of today, I believe.
Oh, that's awesome.
Outstanding.
Yeah, anything we can't say, just IM it to Justin. And
Yeah, there we go.
It's fine.
Yeah, there's an article today. I will put it as a link, November 3rd. So yeah, I didn't see that yet today.
It's technically the 4th here in the UK, so in theory, time zones.
there you go.
It's like being in time warp.
Like it's 7 wrong, so.
Question about Azure Functions. Probably go to Justin, whoever else. When Azure Functions kind of came out, they didn't support PowerShell. Then they did. There's a lot going on, and there's some announcement at Ignite yesterday about Azure Container Apps. Anyone want to talk about the cool stuff you can do with that?
I mean, I guess I can go if anyone else doesn't. Functions is that's yet another area where I talked about, like, I saw what functions could do, and I'm like, I want to go to there. Like, that's going to be so helpful for me. And again, the way that Azure Functions works is that it's basically built on this service called Azure App Service, which is another one of those like really old platforms. And I shouldn't say old's a bad word, it's a venerable platform. But then there's this piece called Web Jobs that runs on top of it that's made for like running executable code for like ASP.NET apps. And then someone really smart, like I'm pretty sure they were looking at like what AWS Lambda was doing. It's like, that serverless stuff is really neat. How can we do that in Azure with a minimal thing? It's like, well, we already have all this scaffolding, this web jobs and everything. Why don't we just build something on top of that? And that's pretty much, it seems to me, like how Azure Functions was born. And so it started out with just .NET stuff, but then as it went forward, it was like, hey, we can do different kinds of workers and that kind of thing. And again, PowerShell is just a .NET application. It's not something special, at least in that sense, is that it's just an application written in C#. So they went ahead and they made that. And again, the whole worker that makes that work is out on GitHub. You can go look at it. And I was able to go look and see exactly how that works and provide my feedback and test it and get things that I wanted into it added. So for those of you who don't know what Azure Functions is it's basically this environment. If you're familiar with the idea of serverless, is not that there's no servers. The idea of serverless is that you don't have to worry about the servers. So wherever you're running your PowerShell scripts today, you got to worry about if that server is going to be up, if it reboots, and even if it's in a virtual machine, like that virtual machine goes down, what do you do? What if all of a sudden there's 1,000 requests to your script? Can that one virtual machine handle it? Do I need to build 500 virtual machines just for that eventuality? Do I want to handle any of that kind of scaling up and scaling down? Or do I just not want to worry about any of that? Do I just want to focus on my code and let that part be handled for me? So that's what Azure Functions does. When you write Azure Functions, you mostly focus on the logic of your code. So my favorite example is something that I wrote for my company that, without going into a lot of detail, it basically bridges 2 ticketing systems together. It processes 5 million tickets a month. It costs $8 to run, and it provides a tremendous amount of value to my company. They were planning, this was going to be, a $250,000 project to do, and I wrote it in about a week. And I wrote it 3 years ago, and I haven't touched it since. And it's scaled from getting about 100,000 tickets a day to 5 million tickets a day without me changing anything, because that's how Functions works. As more requests come in, it just scales it out. And one of the great things about it is I'm cheap. So Azure Functions is dirt cheap. It costs like 0.00013 cents per second of runtime. And it's this great environment for building these really not just simple applications, but really complex applications. There's this thing called durable functions, where you can connect all your functions together and make it so that they have these really advanced loops and stuff that you would typically expect to be like the realm of, oh, you got to be a fancy C# engineer, you got to be a JavaScript guru, you got to go take a computer science class. No, I wrote it on PowerShell. Like it's really not that bad. And so one thing is that Azure Functions is great. It keeps moving forward with PowerShell 7 and such. And it's a great place if you're starting something, you need to automate something in PowerShell. You can look at Azure Automation. Azure Automation is a great place to start, but there's a lot of stuff about Azure Automation that's kind of slow just as a result of it. Functions is much faster. The development environment is great. You can run Azure Functions completely on your local machine. Azure Functions you can run in a Docker container. So you can write in Azure Functions using the whole functions methodology and using the bindings so that you don't have to learn how to talk to a storage queue or something. You just use the bindings. And you can take that and run it in any Kubernetes cluster. You can run it on Azure Arc. We have portions, Azure Functions that we wrote for the cloud, and then we decide, oh, we want to have this part in-house, and then we want this part out in Google Cloud, and then we want this part over here. Well, all of those are just Kubernetes clusters that are managed by Azure Arc, as well as an Azure Stack at a particular customer. And I wrote that once, and it runs literally anywhere, including it's just a Docker container as well. So Azure Functions is a really great way of taking the concept of just this simple runtime and really blowing it out. And PowerShell also works really well in just Docker containers. You can just make a Docker container. There is the PowerShell team maintains a PowerShell container. That's, I think it's mcr.microsoft.com/.net/PowerShell or something like that. But you can do a Docker run on that, and you have a full PowerShell environment ready to go, just like we were talking about with Cloud Shell. It's basically a much more steroided out version of something like that. But what that really gives you is that gives you this environment that, this whole idea of run PowerShell anywhere. Docker is a great way to do that because it strips away all the OS type stuff, all of those concerns, and now you just have this thing. So the new thing that was announced yesterday was Azure Container Apps. And what that is it's basically this thing. There was this thing that already exists called Azure Container Instances, which is like a really easy way to like spin up a container without having to learn Kubernetes or learn how to build all that scaffolding. You literally can just even tie it into your local Docker desktop and say Docker run, and it'll run out in Azure as this Azure Container Instance. So now they have this thing where they're able to take that and take it a little bit further and be able to take a bunch of different components and make a microservice and use this sort of standard interface called Dapper to tie it all together and use the state. And so what's great about that is whereas Azure Functions is very specific to this particular application, like in Azure Functions, like you're using whatever PowerShell worker they're running, unless you bring like your own PowerShell exe along with you and do a bunch of hacky stuff you shouldn't do. But with Azure Container Apps, you can run whatever you want. If you want to run the release candidate of 7.2 because you want to do something, you want to do that in your app, because it's just a Docker container, you can do that. But it can still interface with all that other backend stuff through that Dapper really nicely. And it can do all the same scaling up and scaling down automatically like I talked about. So it's sort of, if you really like functions, but you want it a little bit more hands-on, you want a little bit more control over what happens, the new Azure Container Apps is really worth checking out.
Cool.
So,
awesome. Yeah. I put a blog in the comments. My colleague Martin Kern, off the back of a project, wrote about why we chose functions versus durable functions versus logic apps, because they can be kind of interchangeable at times. So that's a good one. And we have another question from the community. I'm going to ask this to Danny. What is new in OpenSSH?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So if folks don't know, OpenSSH is a project from the OpenBSD Foundation, but we also have a Windows port of OpenSSH to enable SSH functionality in box on Windows machines. That's Win32 OpenSSH. And given that we talk about PowerShell being cross-platform, OpenSSH is really that solution for remoting across platform, both to Linux and Windows machines. But for the question of what's new for OpenSSH, we are updating the version that ships in Windows. So we are looking at updating the next version to 8.6. So OpenSSH version 8.6. And then we're also looking at backporting some of the existing versions to older versions of Windows, just so we stay up to date with some of those features there. We're also looking at ways that we can improve the SSH experience overall in Azure. And so how do we improve the experience when SSHing into Azure machines? And then really overall for the Win32 OpenSSH project, how do we upstream our changes back into the overall OpenSSH project from the OpenBSD Foundation?
And then, Danny, I remember when we first did the OpenSSH, some folks in the Linux community had complained that there were some options that we didn't support and it caused interoperability problems. Have we addressed those, or are there still some options that we're not implementing?
Yeah, so overall, we're pretty close to parity with the existing versions that we have supported. So right now on our beta releases on GitHub, we're up to 8.6. And those are pretty close to parity. There are a few differences, but here and there, and those are all listed in our documentation. But overall, our goal is to get as close to and really upstream back into the overall OpenSSH project. And so over time, a lot of those discrepancies have gone away.
Yeah, I mean, how crazy is it that, again, this team leads so many things that this is the team that reached out and got OpenSSH and is shipping it in Windows. I mean, how crazy is that, right? It's awesome.
Yeah,
I have a funny story about that, if I may. One thing that's so I was at a Halloween party, and one of the things one of my friends wanted me to do was build them like the Stranger Things light wall. Like they wanted me to make like use like a Raspberry Pi or something and make it so that you could like send messages to it and have them come up. So I'm like, okay, I worked on it, I got that figured out. So we brought it over there, and we, as most of my home electronic stuff go, like it was so fragile, it immediately stopped working. I didn't bring my computer with me because I wasn't, it's like, oh, it'll work fine. So I was like, okay, I need to figure this out. So I went over to his laptop, never seen it before, just a normal desktop, and I was able to bring up the SSH command line right there and SSH into my thing to fix it. Like that's amazing. I could just walk up to a Windows machine and have SSH on it ready to go. Like kudos to you guys. Like that was amazing. It was super rad.
Yeah, the SSH client bits are enabled by default on Windows machines. So you're able to just type in SSH and remote into any SSH endpoint. We also do ship the server bits as a feature on demand. So those need to be enabled just for security and then starting the SSH service. But if you're wanting to connect to a Linux endpoint that already has it enabled by default, you can just do that by typing in SSH. And then you can also configure your Windows machines to be at the same state and SSH into those points as well.
Yeah, I got to say, just hats off to the PowerShell team. This team, right, whether it's PowerShell proper or the set of associated things, this team has broken the seal on so many things that were sort of taboo, right? Command line interface, open source, accepting open source, doing open source, bringing SSH in. And a bunch of, you just see this team broke the seal on a set of things that then other people at Microsoft looked over and like, we can do that? And then they followed up. And so really, this team deserves incredible amount of credit. And by the way, none of it has been easy. None of it has been easy. It's not like from top on down, these executives are saying, hey, would you please go do this? I'll just go make it easy for you to succeed. That has not been the path.
Hey, I want to kind of address one of the themes I see in the chat, and the question popped up about WinRM versus SSH. So in PowerShell 7, we already support PowerShell remoting over SSH, and that's the area that will, for future enhancements and investments, will be in the SSH transport. WinRM as a product in Windows is only being serviced, so unless there's a critical security issue, the team that owns it is probably not trying not to touch that code, because if they were to touch it, there's a risk of breaking something else. So with that said, definitely, if you're not already on the SSH bandwagon, you should look into that. One thing I'll mention is if you want to do like modern auth, you want to do like multi-factor auth, guess what? None of that's ever going to come to WinRM. You got to use SSH. Even if you don't care about cross-platform.
Yeah.
Question about functions. When will PowerShell 7.2 be available in Azure Functions?
I believe they will be picking up as soon as we make it available to them.
Awesome.
Yeah, the other nice thing too is that you can, with the latest versions of functions, you can make your own containers to run your functions. So you could run the RC today if you want to. You just sort of like inject. It's not the nice flow that they have. Like you can't use the web interface and all that stuff, but you can definitely like make it work if you need to. But yeah, like Steve says, they're usually pretty good about picking up the new versions and having them available in functions.
Cool. All right, community. Throw some more questions into the chat. Or Jeffrey's going to start singing and dancing in a minute.
So I guess while we do,
gonna-
I'll tell another story. Danny mentioned about the SSH server thing. So what was really useful about that was that we had a requirement. I work for a managed service provider, and so we manage all kinds of different networks. And one thing we had is like we wanted a way to get into boxes to be able to make little changes and that kind of thing. So one thing that was really nice was that we had VS Code has this feature called SSH remoting, which is, if you've never seen it, it's black magic wizardry. Like I still don't understand how it works, but basically, just over an SSH connection, as long as the environment meets certain prerequisites, it can drop a little server in there, and then through the SSH connection, you get your desktop as if you're on that box. Like that box doesn't have to have a GUI, it doesn't have to have any of that, but it's as if you're sitting right in front of that box on your local VS Code, and you can run PowerShell scripts, you can debug them, you can do all that stuff just as if you were sitting right there. So one tricky thing we had is like, oh, that's great, but how am I going to get an SSH connection into there? Well, there's this SSH server for Windows, thankfully, and we were able to get that and unpackage that and make it available as a service. And then we just made a thing that made a little rendezvous thing where it would phone home an SSH forwarder to this website. And I had a test version called pwsh.link that I used to put out there as an example. But basically, there would be this rendezvous point that basically would phone home to this rendezvous point, and then we could connect to the rendezvous point, and they don't have to change anything in their firewall. They basically just have to allow the outbound connection. And now we can ride that connection back in and get a full VS Code desktop on a box inside our customer and do whatever we need to do to resolve that without having to have any kind of graphical interface or worry about any of that stuff. So just another case where just like having these open tools that everybody knows is like, that's one of the great things about PowerShell, and why I love it, is being able to glue stuff together. And so like if I have this and I have this, as long as I have something that can glue them together, I can use them together. And that's PowerShell more than often than not is my tool for doing that.
So I was going to mention, so we've been talking a bunch about Azure and some of the advanced stuff, but there's always been a market and a demand for the core concepts, the basics. And last January, we had Jeff join my user group, Research Triangle PowerShell user group, for PowerShell scripting challenges. There were like there are questions that you should be able to answer in 5 or 10 minutes. And it was a really entertaining evening. We had a lot of input and it went really well. And we're going to be having Jeff come back in January, February, March timeframe. We're going to be working on that. And we would love to have everybody join us for that. Jeff does a really great job of finding sort of the nuances of PowerShell that sort of get forgotten and finding a way to sort of exercise those muscles that we haven't used in a while. And he also has this ionscripted.us website, which is PowerShell challenges that you can go to at any time and sort of work on things like that as well. So just some things coming up that Jeff's involved in that would be really great for community members to jump in on. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add about that, Jeff, but I would invite people to come and join us after the new year. We'll get a link out there and participate. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, thanks for the plugs there, Mike. What I find is that a lot of people will learn PowerShell, they'll go through the month of lunches books, and then they'll say, okay, well, now what? Now what do I do with it? I need something to do. So I've started working on this whole approach of, these puzzles or challenges. I have a book on LeanPub. I think I put a link in Twitter a little bit ago. The PowerShell Practice Primer. That's 100 exercises that you should be able to answer. No scripting. It's just what command would you run in order to solve this question? Now, the questions are kind of trivial. The real learning is how you figure out how to answer the question. So that's really, I want to have people find ways that they can exercise their PowerShell muscles and maybe even have a little fun. So yeah, that what we did with your group back in or earlier this year was fun, and yeah, I'll come up with some new good stuff for next year.
And hopefully, as things start to lighten up here next year, maybe we'll start to see a return of in-person events. So that means PowerShell Summit, hopefully at the end of April. Maybe PowerShell on the River in Chattanooga sometime in the summer. My group hosted a PowerShell Saturday 2 years ago. We'll be looking to do that again, and we'll target probably the fall time frame. So there'll be opportunities for people to finally get together again sometime soon. So keep on looking for those kinds of things.
Please invite.
I'm supposed to be in Nashville, Tennessee, early November. About now, actually.
Automation Summit.
Yeah, the PowerShell.org Automation Summit. So it's now on the 15th. It is remote, unfortunately. But I'm hoping soon they'll come back, right? Hopefully, 2022.
Yeah, by the way, so there was a question in there about PS ARM.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. So, honestly, I view PS ARM as like, an instantiation of our sacred vow, right? So, the sacred vow to remind you is, hey, learn PowerShell, and then we'll do everything we can to make sure that your investment in the skill set pays off by using it over and over and over again. When we first saw the ARM templates, I looked at it, I said, oh my God, those things are horrible. And I reached out to Rasinovich and I said, bud, you want some help here? We can do a declarative service on this. He's like, no, what are you talking about? It's perfect. I was like, okay. And so then, it was going on, and years, and I just kept looking at it. It's like, okay, it seems pretty ugly to me. And then there was this Bicep effort that got started, and it's like, okay, so you finally saw it. That thing's ugly. It needs some help. And but then Bicep's going to be this other tool. We should invest and provide a PowerShell way to do it. And we invested in that, and I forget how long we did, but quite a big effort. And then it turned out that hypothesis didn't work out so well. That there wasn't good uptake, didn't get particularly good feedback. So I think we invested in it, and then just again turned out that wasn't a valid hypothesis. And frankly, from everything I've heard, the Bicep team's sort of rocketing. So at that point, we decided, let's undo this. And,
and it was the project was always kind of like, we want to meet customers where they're at, right? And from what we heard, we had heard a lot of feedback like, hey, we want some way of doing the DSL on these ARM and ARM templates, and we thought, oh yeah, this be a great exploration for PowerShell DSLs and domain-specific language DSL. And we thought, great, let's move forward and explore this. And we saw the Bicep project, and we worked in tandem and partnered with the Bicep folks to make PS ARM. But kind of along with that overall theme of we wanted to meet kind of customers where they're at, we saw a lot of the PowerShell community was really using Bicep and excited about Bicep. And so instead of trying to split the community between Bicep and PS ARM, we took a step back and said, let's just work on making Bicep a better experience for PowerShell users, and vice versa. And that involved and really required us taking a step back from PS ARM, saying, okay, this is a good experiment into one, PowerShell domain specific, PowerShell DSLs, but let's repivot here back into where our community is focused and where our community is excited.
Yeah, let me just add one more thing. I think it's important to, when we started the PS ARM project, we wanted to make clear it was an experiment, right? And we want to do more experiments in the future. And experiments mean that we don't know whether or not we're going to fully invest in this thing going forward or not. Right? We're looking for feedback, and we need to also recognize that we got to fail fast because we don't have infinite resources. And at some point, we decided to pull the plug and we put those resources somewhere else. But do look forward to other experiments in the future from the team. Just be aware that experiments should be experimental.
Yeah.
You should fail fast.
If all your experiments succeed, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Well, if all your experiments fail, you're not doing it right either. But
yeah, somewhere in between.
I have a question from the community that I want to ask everyone. I would like everyone to answer. This is from Johnny Chips, based here in the UK. I think he sits in Wales, and he's up with me. It's almost 1 a.m. our time. So thank you, Johnny, for joining us. What is the coolest or quirkiest thing you have seen PowerShell used to do? And I'd like each and every one of you to answer.
Who wants to start?
Jeff, go first. Jeff, you're on mute. More wine. Get more wine.
More wine. All right. So this is something actually that I wrote that I've used, and I did this a couple of years ago in Singapore at PowerShell Conference Asia, Summit Asia. I have a module called PS Remote Operations. You can install from the PowerShell gallery. And I wrote this because as I travel a lot, at least I used to travel a lot, and I'd have my laptop and go, you know what? I need to run a command that's on my desktop, which I pretty much always leave running at home. Well, obviously I can't remote normally to my desktop. So I built this module that takes advantage of a shared cloud storage like Dropbox or OneDrive. And I can basically submit a command, it goes to the shared drive, and then I have basically an event watcher on my home system that looks for that little JSON file and says, oh, hey, there's an activity you want me to do. I will run that command, and then I can have it return the results back. So I can, and I did this in Singapore, I ran the command or submitted a command, put it up in Dropbox, my home computer back in upstate New York, ran the command, updated the results, put it back in Dropbox, and then within a minute, I got the results in Singapore. So I thought that was really cool. It's a way to do remoting without using PowerShell remoting.
Yeah, actually, we talked about doing that and productizing that a couple times.
Yeah. So that's my quirky thing. I mean, I use PowerShell on a daily basis to do my daily work. I built all sorts of tools like task managers and calendar reminders. I use PowerShell for everything that I can think of doing.
All right, I can go next if you don't mind. So when we first started using .NET Core, one of the things they did, I forget which version of .NET Core itself was, but they started supporting Raspberry Pi. And one of the engineers on the team, Andrew, had an interest in IoT devices. So he wanted to do again, this is like experiment where he built a module which has a repo PowerShell-IoT on GitHub, and basically made it so you can write PowerShell script to do automation against like a Raspberry Pi and other devices and things you have hooked up to it. So that stuff was pretty cool. But the thing is, I remember at one of the PowerShell conference Europe, there was like a contest, I think, and someone had like this robot that was kind of built on top of this using PowerShell to control it, and I thought that was really cool.
Awesome. Next up, I'm going to pick on Mike.
So, my user group would meet twice a month, and when you have that amount of meetings a year, you really start to delve into some sort of ancillary topics for PowerShell. So I've seen quite a bit of interesting uses of PowerShell, but one of the guys in my group wrote basically a database that he was using. He has a media server at home, and he streams movies, but he found some APIs online, and you can basically, he wrote a search utility and put in a search utility, and it pulls back movie posters for all of the movies that he has and then metadata. And I just thought it was a really unique way to, with some simple code, to go out and pull data from a bunch of resources for something that you probably would never even think of using PowerShell for.
That's
so he's got all like the coolest, quirkiest like covers for all the movies that he has in a database. So and basically any movie he wants to watch, he's got all sort of like the collector artwork for all these sort of like indie movies and stuff like that.
Nice. I'm going to pick on Sydney next.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm loving this question and hearing all the answers. Steve actually stole my first one that came to mind with our team member, but also reminded me of another one at a conference, seeing someone use PowerShell to sort of like DJ and create music. And I thought that was super creative and unique way of using PowerShell.
Awesome. Mr. Helmick, you are next.
Oh, well, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but the coolest thing that I've seen PowerShell do is ship. The coolest thing that I see PowerShell do today is to continue to ship. And the reason that this is a big deal for me is that originally in codename Monad, when Monad was publicly available, there were a lot of us that thought this was the right answer, but had no expectation that it would ever ship. When it finally did ship with Exchange 2007, a lot of us working in messaging suddenly had, well, we actually started building clouds at that point, but we didn't know if it'd continue to ship. Microsoft's kind of famous for going, yeah, that was cool, but we don't need that anymore. And so a lot of us thought that we wouldn't keep the tool. But after 15 years, the sacred vow has been upheld. And one of the reasons why I love PowerShell so much is it's the tool that does the job, and it's there for me every single day. So not the answer you're looking for, but I'm still impressed that it ships.
It's a good answer. It's a really good answer. Justin, I'm going to pick on you next.
Yeah, I put mine in the chat, but I guess I'll expand on it a bit. So a while ago, I was working on an Azure function, and I want to integrate Azure functions with the Azure bot service, because what was really neat is, oh, what if I had this thing that I could send PowerShell messages to Teams, Slack, Facebook, whatever they support, but I only have to write it once. Like, I don't have to learn all these different providers. I just have to write it once for Azure bot service, and it'll send it wherever it needs to go. So I actually got all that working, and I was like, oh, this is great. And then I had a separate project where we had put in like some additional new CI, and the guys kept failing their tests, and to the point like I had to stop making them, prevent them from changing their tests to just make them like just putting in $true so that they would work, as opposed to actually having a real test. I was like, guys, that's not how it works. So what I ended up doing was I ended up setting up that bot service. I knew one particular coworker, so it was a joke. I knew all his different social medias. And so I had set up the bot service that whenever one of his CI tests failed, it would pull an insult from some online insult generator and send it to every single one of his social medias every time one of his CI tests failed. He thought that was really funny for about the first 4 times. And then he was like, turn that thing off.
Awesome. Danny, next victim.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have to jump on the IoT bandwagon. I'd say my background at university was all around computer engineering, so embedded systems and things like that. So I actually have a few of those little robots just sitting in my drawer. And so what I had done is when PowerShell IoT came out, I remember sitting in the room with Andrew and just kind of debugging all the problems I would have. And so I ended up doing an automated fish food feeder for my nephew, because all using PowerShell, because he'd always forget to feed his fish and then kill his fish. And so
Can you give that to me? So for my son,
I'll have to find it.
Every day, did you feed the fish? No, Dad, I didn't feed the fish.
So are the fish still alive?
Yeah, because I feed them every night.
How about you, Danny?
No, but from old age.
All right, Jeffrey, you're the last victim.
All right. So yeah, what is most impressive to me was when I moved over to Office a couple of years ago, to find the degree to which the Office team is running everything on PowerShell. And the exec in charge of this area had lunch with them one day, and he said, "Yeah, PowerShell is the reason Microsoft was able to go to the cloud." And I said, "What?" He says, "No, it's absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. Microsoft never would have gotten to the cloud without PowerShell." I said, "Wow, isn't that overstatement?" He says, "Not at all." He says, "Exchange was what led Microsoft to the cloud. And we would never have been able to do it without PowerShell. Before that, we had a whole bunch of things done by hand." He says, "There's no way you could have installed a system and then installed it again and again and again, and then found out why you got it wrong, and then switch it and get it right, and then update your code and be able to test your code before you deployed it, and then deploy it and then test it, et cetera." And so basically that automation through PowerShell was the core reason why Exchange was able to get to the cloud and then lead the rest of Microsoft to the cloud. And so the degree to which Exchange and Outlook and M365 uses PowerShell to do everything, it was not on my radar screen. I mean, I knew they were great partners and all that, but I did not really understand the degree to which it was being used.
Hey, I just saw in the chat a thing from Chris Burgermeister. I did not know this. You could just type in the command line 1 MB, 1 GB, 1 KB, and it'll convert to bytes. I never even knew that was there.
Hey, Mike, I got this book you can get on PowerShell. I think it's like Learn. Yeah, whatever.
You know, listen. I'm not going to sit here and say that I know everything there is to know about PowerShell, right? It's a journey.
It's a journey.
Yeah, I would say that most people, again, as I said in our talk, our PowerShell Unplugged talk, the vast majority of people know a small percentage of what we delivered in PowerShell version 1. There's incredible power there. So learn, explore, have fun.
Awesome. And we have a dog, Wicked. So do your guys' call? Do you want to keep going? Do you want to end on that very good emotional note?
I think that was an awesome ending emotional note.
I think one thing I would just quickly add is like a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. And just a reminder that like there's so many more opportunities to connect with all of us going forward. We have a monthly community call that's on the third Thursday of every month. You can join that. I think it's at aka.ms/join/PS-call. And we do a lot of this same thing, great opportunity to ask questions, and we have community members come on and demo as well. Of course, it's been named a bunch of times during the session, but you can always find us on GitHub, and that's the best way to access the engineering team directly. And then there's a bunch of community resources like user groups, Twitter, Slack, everything like that to stay connected with all these folks. Yeah.
Cool. I've put some of those resources in the comments.
Join PS call?
Yeah. It's late. It's like 1 a.m.
No, is it?
It's not a commandlet. It's a URL.
I think it's a URL. I think that's fine, Jeffrey. I just went to it. And it seemed to work.
I guess join is a verb, but
it's okay. I'm sure it'll be fine.
So much for that sacred vow.
Just make it.
My camera is overheating.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's fine.
It's technology telling us.
It's what I get for turning on my heat because it's cold. All right, so I'm in multicolors now. Cool. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you all to the community for joining. Anyone wants to reach out, please do. Great to have you all with great questions tonight. And I really want to thank Jeff, Steve, Mike, Sydney, Jason, Jeffrey, Danny, and Justin for taking so much time out of your day-to-day to do this. It's been incredible. So
and thank you, April.
Thank you, April.
All right, all. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening, morning.
Bye, everybody.
bye.
Thanks, folks.
Cheers.